You're about to learn the 5 best opening traps against the white's first move pawn to d4. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the trap number 1. In this case, black offers a gambit right from the start. We're offering the pawn here by playing pawn to c5. And after white takes the pawn, you then play pawn to e6, trying to get the pawn back here with the bishop. And in this case, your opponent may think that you clearly messed up something, because they can easily protect the pawn with the move pawn to b4, which also somewhat creates a cramped position for you, because your bishop can't go out normally anymore, etc. In this case, you undermine the pawn here by playing pawn to a5. And here already there are a couple lines for white to lose the game immediately. One of them is to play pawn to a3, trying to protect the pawn symmetrically, but in this case, after you trade pawns on b4, all of a sudden the white's rook on a1 is hanging, and you can just grab it for nothing, so that is one way for you to achieve an immediate victory. Now, let's take a move back and see what else could white have played instead. In this case, a better looking move is pawn to c3, as not only white protects the pawn, but they avoid the painful variation which we just observed. In this case, however, after you trade pawns on b4, you have another really sudden attacking move, queen to f6. And once again, white loses the rook on a1, seemingly out of nothing, but somehow there is no way for them to normally protect this diagonal unless they are ready to sacrifice a lot of material. So that's another way for you to win the game right away. If you think that it is a beginner level stuff that will only work against the complete beginners, then let me show you something. I'm opening here the game database and I'm scrolling to the games, and just look at this. We've got guys over 3,000 rated and 2,900, 2,700, 2,800 who were failing to this simple trap. Therefore, it really works. There we go with the trap number 2. In this case, you play knight to f6, which is also one of the main responses of black here. And after white plays pawn to c4, in this case, you still push the pawn to c5. Now, your opponents are already familiar that taking this pawn against you is deadly. And so they may think, okay, let me just protect it with the knight. In this case, you exchange their pawns on d4, and you play pawn to e5, attacking this knight. It is tempting for white to move forward, and in this case, the knight also threatens to jump onto d6 and potentially to attack you, also taking advantage of these weak squares. And in this case, you push the pawn to d5, offering actually a pawn sacrifice, because after white captures the pawn here, it is really important for you not to recapture on d5, as if you do that, you will fail to another common tactic. Let me just first show you what you should not be doing here. If you take it with the knight, they can recapture with their queen, temporarily sacrificing the queen, but on the next move they're gonna take it back, therefore winning a piece along the way. Therefore, that's certainly not what you should be doing. I just took a few moves back here before you possibly could take this pawn on d5. Your idea is not just to trade material. You're playing in a gambit style, you look for active development, and therefore you go bishop c5. And even though you sacrifice the pawn here temporarily, because maybe you'll still get it back just a little bit later in the future, but what you got here for this pawn sacrifice is a really quick active development. Now your bishop is very active right here, another bishop is also opened and ready to go forward, you can castle easily, and all in all you are ahead in activity compared to white, which gives you good attacking chances. Aside of those general things, there is also one particular trap that you are setting right here. Your opponent may still see that you are attacking this pawn on d5 with your knight and queen, and so they may think, hey, why don't I push it forward to d6? Now this pawn is not only protected by the knight, but it also prepares that really powerful threat knight to c7 with a check to the king and attack off the rook. And therefore, the move looks just so powerful for white. And a lot of your opponents who are not familiar with this line will definitely go for it. And in this case, you may play knight to e4. Even though, objectively speaking, it is not the best response for black, it was better to castle. But if your opponent goes into this line, it is clear that they aren't familiar with this line. And therefore, you can probably safely play knight to e4. It's not that bad anyway. And the idea here is that if white decides to execute their threat and play knight to c7 check, thinking that they're earlier with their attack, you can all of a sudden play queen takes c7, sacrificing the queen here, because on the next move you've got a really powerful move, bishop takes f2, boom, it is checkmate. The trap number 3. Still, we're looking at the traps for the black's perspective. Of course, in this video I'm not covering traps for white. If you want to know the traps for white in the queen's gambit, then you may check out my other video where I cover them in details. I'll link it down below the video. And now let's go with another popular line, kind of popular nowadays, but it still works. So here you're sacrificing another pawn, this time the e-pawn, and after that you go bishop c5. Now most of your opponents will play knight to f3 because it's normal development, but also protecting potentially this pawn on e5, and then you go pawn to d6. And after white takes the pawn, it's very important that you immediately play knight to e7. What's the trick here? The trick is if your opponent captures the knight here, all of a sudden you took that pawn on f2, deflecting the white's king, and then queen takes d1. As a result of this line, you're winning the queen. Also, the white's king is somewhat weak, and all in all, it's just winning for black. Now, why does this trap work so great for black here? Let's take a few moves back here, and I'll show you the idea here. All right, let me take a couple of moves back here. So let's take a look at this position. When you play pawn to d6, right, and your opponent is thinking about his move. Now, when he takes the pawn and you play knight to e7 immediately, what does your opponent thinks, right? They're thinking that you probably pre-moved this move knight to e7 before, up front, because if you're playing an online blitz, you have this option to pre-move, and so a computer will play the move instantaneously after the white's response. So your opponent will be thinking that perhaps you plan to play knight to c3 after he goes something like knight to c3 and you develop your knight, right? So you pre-moved that move, and after they captured, you just didn't realize that the situation changed and you can't go there, and so you play there. Also, in addition to that, because all of the previous moves of black look a bit strange, your opponent may think that you're just a beginner who doesn't know what you're doing, and so they will happily grab the knight, falling right into this trap. Once again, let me show you real quick in the game database how effective this trap actually is. So here we can see the moves. Let's play the move pawn to e5. You see the top response for white is pawn takes. You go bishop c5. The top response by far is knight to f3. You play pawn to d6. Once again, the vast majority of players take the pawn here, you go knight to e7, and the majority of players actually capture your knight, getting into this losing line. Therefore, the trap works really like crazy. Here's the trap number 4 happening in the most classical line of the Queen's Gambit declined. Here after white plays bishop to g5, you may pretend like you overlooked the pin and play knight to d7. In this case, it sets a clever trap, even though the trap is really known, it's a very old trap, and yet a lot of players still keep falling into it just because it's so tempting for white to just think that they can win the pawn using the pin and thinking that they are very smart and their tactical vision is great. But here you can upset them by taking the knight right here, temporarily sacrificing your queen, because after that you've got a powerful response bishop b4, which is a check to the white's king, and as you can see there is no other way for white to cover the king other than sacrificing their queen on d2. And now after you take the queen back, you can then grab this bishop on d8, and as a result you have 3 minor pieces against 2 minor pieces of white, therefore a clearly winning endgame. Even though the trap is old, different players keep falling right into it. For example, the game I'm showing to you right now was played between 2 players rated over 2700. It's an online blitz game, therefore even strong players sometimes are unfamiliar with it. I just put the position once again before white went down with taking that pawn on d5. If you're wondering how white should play here, just a few days ago I recorded a video where I showed a relatively unknown line for white here, which you can use to get a great attacking position. So if you're playing this position as white, click the link below the video and check out that line. I'm sure you will enjoy it. The next trap is quite unknown. At least I think that the vast majority of players are unfamiliar with it, and therefore you can really give it a try. It happens in the Queen's Indian defense. Here after white goes knight to f3 and you go pawn to b6. Also one of the really classical chess openings. Here the white's main move is pawn to g3, you play bishop a6, attacking this pawn right here on c4, so white wants to protect it with playing pawn to b3, and in this position black plays different moves, like something like pawn to d5 or maybe bishop b4, but you can play another move which is less known, pawn to c5. Here you're hitting the white center with another pawn, and at first it looks like this move is actually bad because it allows white to, instead of trading the pawn right here, to advance their pawn forward by playing pawn to d5. And this move looks pretty strong for white, as your knight can no longer be developed to c6. Moreover, white is ready to potentially lock down your position completely by playing pawn to d6 in the future. All in all, it looks like white seizes the space advantage in the center. Your bishop on a6 is kind of dull. Once again, it just goes to show that pawn to d5 is a really tempting option for white here. But in this case, you've got a really sudden response. Well, first of all, of course, you may say this. And then you play knight takes d5. A shocking move, as you're just losing a piece for nothing, but then you go queen to f6, and you may notice a similarity to one of the other traps which we observed previously. Here you're still hitting that rook on a1, and therefore you are winning some material right here. I also noticed, I just checked in the database, how do white responds here, and very often they're trying to kind of counter trick you, so to say. They're thinking to themselves, okay, if I'm gonna lose this rook, then let me try to trap the black's queen here. So they play queen to c2, and after queen takes a1, they play knight to c3. And the white's idea here is pretty clear. Your queen is locked there on a1, and therefore if white can finalize their development and then play bishop to b2, they will be able to grab it. But notice that they can't play bishop b2 right away as the bishop is pinned. Therefore, they still need to play two other moves, bishop to g2 and then castle, and only then they'll be able to play bishop b2, which actually gives you plenty of the time to refute the white's plan. But I just want to make sure that you know the refutation. The refutation here is the move pawn to c4. And if you know this move, you are winning here. The idea behind the move pawn to c4 is that you're preparing the move bishop b4, which you're going to play in the next move regardless of what white does. For example, bishop g2, and you go bishop b4. And it completely, shuts down any attacking opportunities for white. Moreover, white is now in a big trouble, because you're now attacking the knight with the bishop and the queen. They cannot protect it with the bishop, as the bishop is still pinned, and on top of that, you're still having a material advantage. This is completely winning for black. Now I've got a quick puzzle for you, which will also help you to know one more opening trap, a bonus trap against white's move pawn to d4. In the trap which we analyzed first in this video, pawn to c5, white takes pawn to e6, white goes pawn to b4, protecting their pawn, and you play a5, undermining this pawn construction. Here we analyzed previously the white's move pawn to c3, and if you remember, it loses after an exchange. You got this move queen to f6, and after that you win this rook on a1, right? So that was one of the traps we analyzed. Just a quick recap. Now, but in this case, there is another way for white to protect their pawn. It's to move bishop to d2. In this case, they're trying to protect the pawn by the bishop, and it still looks quite good for white, because once again, this pawn on c5 is still locking your pieces out, and it looks like a good idea for white. In this case, you go knight to c6, attacking the bishop, and as it goes backward, here's the position where I would like to ask you to think about it and to write it down in the comments below the right move for black. There are a couple options black has, and your task is to find the most powerful one.